For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Betend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. Most state guidelines require that in order to remain legal, industrial hemp must contain less than 0.3% THC. Anything above that, and your legal hemp is now illegal cannabis. The problem with that is that 0.3%, that number is completely arbitrary. And the act of coming under the threshold is essentially the genetic equivalent of trying to hit the bullseye on a moving target's carnival game. You know, the ones that would be gambling if there was anything at stake more valuable than a Pokemon plushie, like, say, $1,000 crops. While there are some things that farmers can do to influence THC content in their crops, the truth is it's a toss-up, a scientific coin flip, ultimately leaving farmers constantly at risk of losing an entire crop. To nail down the details, I decided to call up Justin Allen, co-CEO of Lumen Extracts, to find out more. So first things first, Justin, thank you so much for talking to me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The first question I wanted to ask is kind of a simple one, but what exactly is hot hemp?
That's a good one to lead with. Yeah. So when the 2014 Farm Bill was introduced and sort of launched these pilot programs, or the allowability for states to run their own pilot program, they didn't give a whole lot of guidance to go off of for field testing and the way in which the state ag departments were to govern the hemp growers, the hemp processors. There was a lot left up to the imagination and for interpretation. A pretty big item on that list of things that were left open to interpretation was the fact that that 2014 Farm Bill specified that all hemp to be considered hemp needed to be below 0.3% THC. And what ended up happening over time was this definition of what is 0.3% THC started to evolve. And as more testing labs started to test hemp samples, they said, well, wait a second. Do you want us to test the total THC, as in the THCA and the Delta 9 THC? Or do you want us to just test the Delta 9? And most of your listeners are really savvy, and so they'll know that the THCA is the acidic form of the Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and it has the potential to convert into Delta 9. And it does so fairly readily with just a little bit of heat, light, exposure to air. Any of these factors can influence that THCA to convert into Delta 9. So when the hemp breeders were really starting to get the ball rolling and they were producing these phenomenal plants where they were at 1:30 ratio of THC to CBD, 1:50 ratio, and even sometimes as high as a 1:100 ratio, the Delta 9 content in the plants was never exceeding that 0.3, or only in rare cases, as long as they were hitting that 1:30 ratio or above. However, when you took into account the THCA and the Delta 9 together, now you get into a realm where the total potential Delta 9 THC is almost always exceeding that 0.3% threshold whenever you have a hemp plant that's growing a substantial amount of CBD. And you know, what we would target in the field as a farmer would be somewhere in the range of 12 to 18% CBD content. And that way, and that's in the flower itself. So that way, when we go to harvest the whole plant and we shuck the bud and leaf material from the stem, our now hemp biomass, which is the combination of the leaf and the flower material, will be somewhere around 8 to 10% CBD. And that will yield a quality extract and leave some room for profitability in terms of yield of an actual oil from the field. And so the problem comes in when this confusion arose over whether or not the testing labs and the state ag departments needed to be targeting total THC or just Delta 9. And ultimately, the 2018 Farm Bill cleared that up, and they specifically called out total THC as the testing parameter. And so now that left it up to the testing labs to apply a formula which some people argue is fairly arbitrary, and some argue does have a scientific backing behind it, having to do with the difference in the molar mass of those two molecules, the THCA and the delta 9. At any case, what they end up doing at the testing lab is they take your THCA value of the flower that's collected when your compliance officers come out to the field to collect a sample, and they apply a formula of 0.877% to that value, and they deem that number as the delta 9 potential of that THCA. And so so if your THCA is 10%, let's say, it would never be that high in hemp, but if it was, then you'd have 8.7% delta 9 after that formula was applied to it. So this created a lot of issues because now farmers who were trying to just grow really high quality CBD flower for both the smokable market and the topical and tincture market now are being sort of stonewalled by this seemingly unfounded and arbitrary regulation that is being imposed by the USDA through the Farm Bill of this total THC value. And in the hemp plant, what the breeders have found is that whenever that CBD gene is turned on to express CBD heavily in the plant, it's unavoidable to also have that delta 9 gene turned on as well. And they're working on this daily. I mean, all of the hemp breeding companies are trying to find ways to circumvent that genetic tendency towards the co-production of THC and CBD in the plant. And with technologies like CRISPR getting more and more streamlined and falling more and more into grace with the public in terms of public opinion on using some genetic modification tools when necessary, it's leading to the development of some strains that could very well meet farmer expectations in the field, but also be compliant. And the easiest way around this whole issue would just be for the government to modify that legislation or that rule that the USDA put down in the 2018 Farm Bill to reflect reality, which is that it's very difficult for the farmers with the current breeding technology that's been developed to meet those expectations. And depending on which state you're operating in, based on that state's pilot program, and now the states are getting into having actual USDA approved state plans, moving out of the pilot programs and into what the 2018 Farm Bill has established to be these USDA approved state plans unique to each state, or the states can opt to just operate under the 2018 Farm Bill itself on sort of a more federal level. But in instances where the states want specific rights for their farmers or some sort of sovereignty over their program, they can elect for that, but they just have to have that plan approved by the USDA through a formal process. And many states have submitted plans and had them approved. But going back to the hot hemp issue, depending on which state you're operating in, will dictate the window in which testing for your hemp will occur. And so in some states, that window is 28 days prior to your intended harvest date, such as Oregon. That was the case up until this season, and Oregon then moved it to a 2-week window. In some states, it's 10 days prior to harvest. And the closer you get to your harvest date, where that plant is at peak ripeness, the higher the delta 9 value is going to become, as well as all of your other minor cannabinoids and your CBD. And so then you get into this issue where the farmer has to try to kind of do maybe some of their own field testing to see where are my plants at. And if they come in and they randomly sample, what if they get that one phenotype or chemotype in this case that's expressing a higher delta 9 concentration, and that's not totally reflective of my field in general. And it creates, of course, a lot of stress for farmers who are trying to monetize this crop with falling biomass prices. And the last thing we need is disruptive legislation that disables farmers from being successful.
I feel like the first and most obvious question is, if someone came out and did do one of these random tests and that particular plant happened to test over that 3% limit, or the delta 9, pushed it over there, suddenly this crop becomes illegal if that farmer doesn't have a license to grow cannabis. Like, it goes from being hemp to cannabis based on that test, right?
That's right.
So what happens to somebody who now suddenly has a crop of illegal stuff?
Well, it's certainly nothing short of tragic. And the farmer does have the option in most states to call for a retest. In most states, it's up to 3 times that they can have the certified testing agency come out again and do more random sampling just to confirm that, did they happen to just pull from a couple plants that were particularly high in THC? And can you come back and take a more representative sample of my field? Now, if all those subsequent tests also show that the Delta-9 concentration is above 0.3%, the Farm Bill makes it clear in no uncertain terms that that crop is subject to destruction. And if the farmer is found to do anything except destroy that crop, then they can have their license revoked, and of course, that would prevent them from growing future hemp crops.
So you mentioned that the Delta-9 is going to be higher the closer you get to harvest. If someone is noticing, like, I'm doing a test here and we're 30 days out and, oh boy, we're getting up there. Is it possible for farmers to say harvest a crop early and perhaps salvage it in some way? Or does that not make any sense at all?
Absolutely. Yeah. So usually around the 4-week mark, in most of the what we would consider high quality CBD varietals that are available for farmers to choose from today, you're looking at about a CBD content of 8% in the flower. And your target, of course, is that 16 to 20%, maybe even higher in the flower. But even at that 8% mark, you could still make a profitable oil from that plant. And so if you tested it yourself or had a testing lab come out for, say, $150 and come do a random sample of your field to sort of mimic what's going to be done by the ag department, they could give you a really good idea of where that THC value is going to be, and they'd be able to probably confirm the Delta-9 to be somewhere around 0.15 to 0.2%. That's what historically we've seen in all the CBD crops that we've grown, is that 4-week mark. That's right around where the Delta-9 is sitting. And it's just the closer you get to that 8-week mark where the plant would be in full maturity and ready to harvest, the more you're riding that line, so to speak.
So let's talk about the sort of sticking point here, that like razor's edge of 3%. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that in some ways the regulations themselves were written with a certain lack of a full understanding of even how to measure THC. Do we know why 3% is the chosen number, and if there's any scientific basis there? Are there arguments from farmers that perhaps that's too strict? Where does that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that all the farmers who are boots on the ground actually growing the crop know that it is too strict, and it is sort of based loosely on this study that was done in the 1970s of some of the hemp that was being cultivated by the U.S. government, and they took some leaf tissue samples from vegetative plants, not even flowering plants, and they determined a baseline for what would be typical Delta-9 THC concentration in the leaves of an industrial hemp plant. And that value was determined. Back then, I think the methodology was gas chromatography, whereas most of the labs now are using high-pressure liquid chromatography, which is, in many instances for measuring cannabinoid content, more reliable. But at any rate, this 0.3% value was established, and you can see how the leaf in a vegetative industrial hemp plant from that era was probably much different than the Delta-9 content in a flower of industrial hemp today. And that is the basis for establishing that value, or certainly it's the only basis that folks who dig into this part of the industry and the history of these laws and how this legislation gets developed, that's the only basis that anybody's been able to find. So I would like to think that it's simply an oversight and had no nefarious intent about it, but it very well could have been that in order to get bipartisan support for the 2018 Farm Bill and the 2014 Farm Bill before that, that they needed to have some sort of regulation based on some past research that would have mandated a Delta-9 concentration at a specific value. And most lawmakers aren't going to have an opinion or any factual basis to back up how much Delta-9 in the plant actually produces a psychoactive effect similar to marijuana.
Right. And it does. I mean, it's probably fair to say that at this point, we don't quite have. It seems like a very difficult thing to legislate because body types and individual people are going to react differently. The form of ingestion is going to matter here. Is it fair to say that this is kind of an arbitrary number?
It's very fair to say that. And interestingly, just a couple of days ago now, actually, I think this proposal only came out about 48 hours ago. Rand Paul, the senator out of Kentucky, has put forth some proposed legislation that would actually accomplish a couple things in the hemp industry that are very important. The largest of which is raising that Delta 9 THC concentration, or the total THC concentration as of the 2018 Farm Bill, from 0.3% to 1%. And that would allow for hemp farmers growing all of the commercially available CBD plants that are, the most sought after, to be able to be cultivated to the end of their lifespan, reach the maximum CBD content possible, and still be within compliance. And so that's really exciting legislation for the hemp industry. It's got a lot of bipartisan support. It's got support from many Farm Bureau agencies and farmers alliances across the country. So, I saw that. And I was very encouraged that we were making some moves forward, especially because in August 20th, 2020, the DEA issued an interim rule that basically stated that the definition of hemp does not automatically exempt any product derived from a hemp plant, regardless of the Delta 9 THC content of the derivative. And in order to meet that definition of hemp and thus qualify for exemption from Schedule 1, the derivative, or in this case, like a hemp oil, must not exceed the 0.3% Delta 9 THC limit. And when they came out and made this interim rule, it was terrifying to a lot of processors in the industry because any processor who's working with the hemp plant knows that when you take it from that biomass stage and you move it into the stage of being an oil, you effectively concentrate all of the chemicals in that plant by about sixfold. And so even if the biomass was only 0.2% when it was harvested, it was fully compliant in the field, you're going to be looking at an extract that's now got 1.2 to 2% THC. And the DEA issued this ruling outside of the 2018 Farm Bill. This ruling was not sanctioned or endorsed by the USDA. But as we know, the DEA is a government regulatory body that's not fond of anything in the marijuana realm, and it's been very reluctant to retrieve cannabis in any form from the Schedule 1 controlled substances list. And so this proposed bill from Rand Paul, I think, would really help out the case of the Hemp Industries Association, who is the main member representing the hemp industry right now in this lawsuit against the DEA challenging that interim rule that came out in August.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And this might be a stupid question in terms of I don't know whether or not you can actually answer it or even have a sense of it. But do you think the DEA understands that? Or was this just copy pasted? 3% was the regulation last time, so that's what it should be here. Do they understand that concentrating it actually changed? Does that...
Your question makes sense, and I wondered the same thing. And the DEA has been pressed on this matter, and they have publicly stated that their intent behind this interim rule was merely to support with a legislation through a government body that is separate from the USDA, the language of the 2018 Farm Bill. The problem is that in the Farm Bill, it specifically calls out the hemp biomass. It does not make reference to a tolerable level of THC in extracts. It just says that any constituent of the hemp plant, be it seed, stalk, flower, or stem, that exceeds the 0.3% threshold is no longer considered hemp. And so there was this, before the DEA issued this interim rule, there was this implication through silence in the Farm Bill that we all know that just basic science and basic chemistry leads the biomass into a state that would be out of compliance were we to subject it to that same standard that we're subjecting biomass to.
So, I mean, that was going to be my next question was, is there a conversation happening between the industry and between the FDA? Where do people get their information, and how does the industry, I know that there are these organizations, and you mentioned the lawsuit, but that's sort of a combative thing. Like, is there a stage before we get to that point where someone says, wait a second, what you're writing down here doesn't make sense, and I can show you why? Or that's just, we're not there yet?
There was a comment period that was allowed to issue comments on both the 2018 Farm Bill, the DA interim rule, like all of these sort of statements and mandates that are handed down do go through a comment period. And the one most recently was actually reopened because it received so much public input. I think they had over 4,600 comments initially, so that they then opened it up to have a period of extension and allow for more commentary from the industry. However, it tends to be kind of a one-way dialogue because it's like they open up for response from the industry and the community, but there's such an onslaught of commentary, probably half of which I'm just inferring, but I haven't read all the comments, but probably half of which is unintelligible or not founded on any kind of cohesive or cogent argument, and it's got to be difficult, to, in all fairness, to sift through some of that.
Absolutely. So let's move a little bit towards, I guess, for lack of a better term, solutions. What exactly is THC remediation, and how can that help somebody who's pushed into hot hemp territory?
Yeah. So THC remediation at this stage that the industry is in is particularly geared toward helping farmers who have gotten their oil or gotten their biomass out of the field and gotten it into the first stage that makes it shelf stable, which is the crude full spectrum hemp oil. And as many of your listeners probably know, that's sort of usually done with CO2 or ethanol in the hemp space, just because those are two solvents, if you will. CO2 isn't technically a solvent because it's compressed gas, and it's sometimes considered a solventless technology. But for the sake of the conversation, it's typically done in one of those two ways because of the scale that those two substances are able to be used in extraction with. And by taking the biomass to that first stage of crude hemp oil, you've got it now to a point where the CBD and the other minor cannabinoids are going to stay relatively intact over time. The shelf life is considered to be well over 2 years, and there's plenty of hemp oil that buckets of get cracked open after that time frame, and the oil is still very much usable and intact. However, in the biomass stage, we've got CBD degradation happening in dry storage at a rate as high as sometimes 1% a month, but typically about 2% every 6 months. And so if you had to store your biomass for a year before it was able to be extracted and you were able to afford that service, you might have had a CBD biomass that was 10%, but now it's maybe as low as 6%. And that, of course, devalues your crop, and it's a problem that farmers try to avoid as much as possible. So they work with crude oil extractors, sometimes on a tolling basis by offering them a service fee, but sometimes also offering them a split of the crop. So you extract it for me and put it into a crude oil, and you can have a portion of that oil to sell as you wish or further refine as you wish. And so in terms of the hot hemp in the field, the only real obstacle, or the only real way that you're going to get around that obstacle, is by harvesting early or calling for a retest and having your field reapportioned and see if there's any way that you can get that hemp to be in compliance. And an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's totally true in the hemp space as well. And just selecting a really good hemp breeding company and starting off with good feminized genetics that are reliable and trusted in the industry is your best weapon against hot hemp. But once it's in the crude oil stage, now we get into the realm of THC remediation, because as I mentioned, when you concentrate that biomass into an oil, you're now looking at a THC content in that oil of 1.2% to we've seen as high as 3%. And if all you're intending to do with that oil is dilute it into a tincture and sell it on the open market as a full spectrum oil with the entourage effect intact, to a clientele who isn't concerned about having some latent THC in their product, then you don't really need THC remediation. However, if you're a farmer that's got this crude hemp oil and you're in Oregon and you get a buyer for that oil in Colorado, they're really interested, let's say, in your farming practices. They appreciate the work you've done as a small family farm, let's say. Let's say maybe you've gone the extra step of getting your field certified organic and adding that higher value to it. You want to be able to move that crude hemp oil across the country to any state you please. But the problem is that now that that hemp oil is above that 0.3% total THC we were talking about, now it's considered a Schedule 1 substance by the DEA. And if you are to move that hemp oil across state lines, you're now getting into an area where you're trafficking a controlled substance. And the pilot programs within the states and the new 2018 Farm Bill program do protect farmers within their own state to sort of work with this product, move it around within their state. But the moment it leaves state lines, if that THC is anything above 0.3% in the oil, now you're, technically heading into felony territory.
Right. Yeah.
And then, another piece that's outside of sort of statutory or regulation is this element that a lot of folks in the CBD marketplace are looking for a way to consume the cannabinoids present in the hemp plant, but without the THC for various reasons. Some of them religious, some of them on personal substance use guidelines for their own life. And then most commonly, if people are being subjected to drug tests for work or school or otherwise, it may be a high priority to them to make sure that the hemp oil they're consuming really has no THC in it, or as little as possible. And the amounts of THC that are in the hemp oil prior to THC remediation, even when diluted into something like an MCT oil or an olive oil carrier, are high enough to trigger a positive on a drug test if you're taking them on a routine basis. And those are the two main benefits of this THC remediation platform that's arisen as a need in the industry is being able to move it freely across state lines and even internationally, but also to help the end consumer who really needs to consume a product that doesn't have that latent THC.
So that means, because of this sort of catch-22 that you laid out, if I was interested in doing THC remediation, I'd have to kind of work within my state. How does that sort of play into, I know that your company offers THC remediation, but broadly, and maybe that's not the impetus, how did you kind of get to where you are? And tell me a little bit about Lumen Extracts itself and how you came to see that need.
Yeah, great question. Our company was definitely born out of watching the Oregon hemp market struggle to find creative outlets for all of these different refined goods that the industry was producing. And, the 2018 season, we saw unprecedented levels of acreage being grown, and a lot of farmers wanting to get in and monetize on their land and figure out a way to cultivate this high value crop. However, a lot of people jumped in without contracts for having their hemp dried, without contracts for having it processed. And sadly, a lot of hemp, as a lot of you are familiar with, just rotted in the field, or maybe they got it dried, but they didn't have enough capital left over after all of their expenditures on the farm to get it into that shelf-stable crude oil. And even our Senator Jeff Merkley, he called in late 2019 and said, if there's one thing Oregon needs more of, it's more processors and handlers to help get the hemp products out of the field into market.
Yeah.
And we had my co-CEO Brianna and I had a previous significant experience with hemp farming and processing, and we knew that there was a fair amount of drying and crude oil processing already happening, but there was really a big lack in Oregon of refinement and particularly THC remediation. And so, we consider the hemp industry to be sort of a three-legged stool. We have, after the farming itself, we've got the drying and crude oil extraction as one leg. The middle leg would be the refinement into higher value goods, things like distillates, THC-free products, water-soluble products, bulk formulated goods. And the final leg being co-packing and getting those raw hemp ingredients that are now higher value into an end consumer package in a Cgmp, ideally, environment that's able to support whatever brand mission the farmer or processing lab is setting out to achieve. And so we really just wanted to devise a business model that could come in and just support and start filling needs for these farmers and other processing labs to build bridges to the consumer marketplace, create higher value goods out of this crude oil that would really allow the farmers and labs to hold on to some of those profit margins that we saw a lot of the retail shops continuing to hold on to in the value of that end consumer packaged good. And so we set out to create a company that would offer those pathways seamlessly, affordably, that we could do so, reliably and with transparency, to just have a company model that, people know what they're getting every time, and it's a repeatable result, and working with people who have good customer service and know how to treat fellow farmers and labs and know what their priorities are.
So I guess the last question for you, Justin, would just be, looking forward, what is next for you? What's next for Lumen? Whether that's next year or a few years down the line, it looks like we're heading into a lot of potential uncertainty, but a lot of potential change. How do you look at the future and prepare to kind of evolve the company in the midst of all of that?
Yeah, we're facing some definitely unprecedented economic hardship across so many industries, and the hemp industry is no exception. We see cyclical sales cycles every year in the hemp and cannabis space. Around harvest time, there's a market flood, and demand decreases, supply increases, and then moving into early spring, we see supply start to dwindle, and prices can stabilize a little bit. But with COVID, it's made it even more exacerbated than usual. So looking into Q1 of 2021, Lumen is achieving its organic certification through Organtil Certified Organic. So we'll be able to offer our Thc Remediation platform to any labs or farmers who want to take advantage of it, who already have gone to the effort to certify their crop and certify their oil. We see this as a unique opportunity for industry partners because the typical approach for Thc remediation is via a process called chromatography, which uses a sort of stationary media to separate the THC from the rest of the cannabinoids. The only problem with that is that it also tends to use solvents which most would consider somewhat harsh, things like methanol and acetonitrile, and which also disqualify any product that touches those solvents from being certified organic. And our process is able to convert the THC into other minor cannabinoids that enhance the value of the product, and we can do so in a certified organic fashion. And we're looking in Q2 to obtain a Cgmp compliance audit from a third-party certifier. There is no Cgmp certification specific to hemp. The FDA is still working on that with industry partners throughout the hemp space, but hemp producers, processors, farmers can become Cgmp compliant with current good manufacturing practices. And that's also a way that we're planning to enhance the value of our partners' goods and our own goods. But we're definitely looking to just cater to the B2B marketplace and make sure that we're providing good quality extracts of tea-free distillate, tea-free full spectrum crude oil, water-soluble formulations in Q3, and bulk formulated goods throughout the year.
Justin Allen is the co-CEO of Lumen Extracts. Justin, thank you for taking the time to break that all down. You have an incredible way of just telling the story very casually, and it can sometimes be a complicated story. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here, Jesse.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Betend, and thank you for listening.